Early in my career, I was asked to teach a course in Black history, and in preparation for that, I read a great many books, one of which was Gilbert Ossowski's Harlem, the Making of a Ghetto. And early on in that book, Professor Ossowski declared that Black Harlem in the 20th century was created by a young man by the name of Philip Payton from Westfield, Massachusetts. Now, at the time, I was living in Westfield, Massachusetts, and I had never heard of him. I began to ask around among longtime residents, and they had never heard of him either. That led me to a research project of trying to find out who was this mysterious Philip Payton, and why did he create Harlem, and probably more importantly, why did no one in Westfield know anything about him? So this is the story then of the Payton family of Westfield, Massachusetts, an adventure on a national scale. The story begins during the Civil War. In 1862, the Union branch of the Union Army, led by General Burnside, invaded North Carolina. The plan was to cut off the harbors along the North Carolina coast so that foreign shipping couldn't get in and out, and ultimately, potentially, to get behind the Confederate troops in Virginia. This is the North Carolina coast. It's called the New Bern Expedition. Among the troops that Burnside took to North Carolina was the 27th Massachusetts Regiment. That was a regiment that was formed of men from western Massachusetts, and particularly Company K of that regiment was from Westfield itself. The 27th Regiment was stationed in the town of Washington, North Carolina, on the eastern coast. This is a map of the fortifications that the 27th Regiment set up in Washington, and Company K is portrayed on the map. The eastern coast of North Carolina was famous in one sense for a fairly large free black population that was skilled and literate. Now, among the blacks who lived in Washington was the Payton family. Creus and Winnie Payton had a number of children. We know of 3 sons in particular. Warren was the oldest, James was the youngest, and in the middle was Philip. It's not clear whether this was a slave family or a free family. The only direct evidence we have is that the oldest son, Warren, said that he was born a slave. Some of the black population of Washington County were enlisted by the Union troops in a local militia. Others simply interacted for the year and a half with the Union troops from the 27th. In early 1864, the 27th withdrew from the coast of North Carolina and was shipped to Washington, D.C. Along with them went at least one of the Payton family, Philip, the middle son. When in Washington, D.C., he enrolled briefly in the Wayland Baptist Seminary for freed slaves. A short time thereafter, he moved to New York City, where he became a barber and also became a member of a black Masonic organization. In 1872, he moved north to the community of Westfield, Massachusetts. He became a barber in the shop of Philip Gama on Elm Street. in what was then the Opera House, this large building on the corner. And he had an apartment over the shop. In 1874, he married Annie Ryans, a freed black from Baltimore, Maryland. They were married in the Methodist Church in Westfield. She also was a ladies' hairdresser, and she was skilled in making wigs and hair pieces out of human hair. The two of them worked in various shops around town. Ultimately, they became successful enough so that Philip bought a whole block of buildings. Now, this is on Elm Street. These buildings are on Elm Street today. The big building is known as the Lamson Building, and this block to the right was the block he purchased. It included 3 stores. He and Annie would live over those stores, and for the next 30 years, they would operate a number of businesses in this block. The businesses can be followed in ads in the Westfield City Directory. Here are directory ads from the 1870s, the 1880s. What I particularly want to point out is that Philip lists himself as Payton's Ladies and Gents Hairdressing and Bathing Emporium. That second thing is kind of an interesting touch. You have to understand that in the 19th century, most people had no facilities in their living quarters for taking a bath. It was just impossible. There wasn't running water to begin with, and most places were too small. So think of all the old cowboy movies you've ever seen, where the cowboy goes to town, goes to the barber shop, gets his hair cut and a shave, and then has a bath. Philip provided one of the first public bathing facilities in town. Mrs. Payton had her own business for human hair goods. Payton was also famous for a number of patent medicines that he developed, particularly for hair dye, hair coloring, hair growth, and Mrs. Payton in particular for her wigs, toupees, and hair extensions that she made. The family became fairly prosperous. Now, I said that he bought that block. The block cost $5,000. Now, you have to keep in perspective that $1,000 was about the salary that Westfield paid to the then president of the Westfield Normal School, $1,000 annually. Or the superintendent of schools in Westfield got about $1,000 a year. A public school teacher made between $200 and $300 a year. A barber would ordinarily make between $250 and $400 a year. Now, he did not pay cash for that. He got a mortgage. And again, this getting mortgages in the 19th century is going to play an important part in the story. You didn't go to banks and get mortgages. What you did is you approached the owner of a building and agreed to take on the costs of the building, paying the owner approximately what we would call rent per month, and that would be applied against the mortgage. The important part for our story is that here is this, let's say, ex-slave from North Carolina appearing in Westfield in the 19th century, and someone is willing to grant him $5,000 worth of mortgage. He has connections in town. We don't know what they are, but somebody is backing and supporting him. Philip and Annie have a number of children. In 1875, the daughter Susan is born. In 1876, son Philip Jr. is born. And in 1877, son James is born. 5 years later, their third son, Edward, is born. All of the children attend the Green District School. This was the school, as its name implies, for all the people who lived around the center of Westfield, the Green. This school sat on the corner of Washington and School Street, where the present police station is. This is a photo of the Green District School class in 1888, and there is 13-year-old Susan standing in the back row. We also have photos of Philip, James, and Edward in the elementary classes in that school. Upon completion of elementary school in the late 19th century, most students left school, went to work, or began the processes for females that would lead to marriage in a few short years. That did not happen to the Payton children. They instead attended the Westfield High School. This school sat on Broad Street and remained as a public school building until the early 1960s. Susan graduated from high school in 1894. This is her graduation program. The interesting thing about this is that Westfield had a population of 10,000 people in the 1890s. There are only 22 graduates of the high school. And of those 22, there are only 6 in what we would call the college prep course. 4 females and 2 males. Susan is a graduate of the Latin Scientific course program. She is one of a handful of young people in Westfield that year who is making preparations to go to college. Unusual for any person in Westfield at that time, extremely unusual for a black person at that time. Susan attended the Westfield Normal School. This is a photo of the outing club at Westfield, and Susan is here in the front row. It's kind of interesting if you notice that she is not the only black student in that picture. In the 19th century, Westfield had a number of black students, quite unusual for that day and age. After graduation, Susan went back to North Carolina briefly, and then to New Jersey, where she became a public school teacher for the next 2 decades. Her brothers followed much the same course. Philip and James were very active in athletics in school. This is a picture of the first football team at Westfield High School. It includes both Philip and James in the front row. Philip in particular was very athletic and loved to play football. Here's a picture of the Westfield track team, the high school track team. And there is James again in the front row. Philip did not participate in track. Now, Philip was not the student that his sister and his 2 brothers were. In fact, by 1893, when he was in 10th grade, his father pulled him out of the high school because he said that he was getting in with bad company, and his father thought that his life was going to pieces. His father shipped him off to North Carolina to attend a small black college, Livingston College in Salisbury, North Carolina. His father had known the founder of the school and thought this would be a good way of getting a more proper moral atmosphere for his son. Philip was there for less than a year. The records of that college say that he graduated, but that doesn't make an awful lot of sense. Philip came back to Westfield and in 1895 re-enrolled in the Westfield High School as a junior. Now, he was supposed originally to have graduated with the class of 1895. He couldn't because he was only a junior. And yet, he had his class picture taken with the rest of his fellows. We have the class photographs, we at the library have the class photos of that class of 1895, and here is Philip, whose picture was included with the rest, even though he wasn't even in that class at that point in time. Philip also did not graduate. He broke his wrist that fall while playing football and promptly dropped out of school again. Schooling was just not for him. His father demanded that he have an occupation, and so his father took him into the barber shop, and Philip would remain there for a few years. He hated it. His brother James, however, was very successful in school. James graduated in 1896. This is his graduation list. He is a member of the classical course. What that meant is that he learned both Latin and Greek, and usually one European language, either French or German. He was aimed for a college education. Now, in those days, Westfield sent between 1 and 2 males per year to college. James went to Yale. Now, I can't impress upon you enough just how unique this was. James probably was only the second black student to attend Yale. We have no idea how he got there. No idea why that was the aspiration for the family. No idea what was behind all of this, but one has to assume that there were patrons within the white community who was supporting this family and supporting its high-achieving children. James wrote a couple of short articles for small black literary publications describing his life at Yale. He apparently, at least according to those articles, had a great deal of success there. This is his entry in the Yale yearbook. It is a supportive, positive kind of entry. He graduated in 1901, got a job at Wiley College in Marshall, Texas. That was a small black school in Texas. He got a job teaching Latin and Greek. He taught for 1 year. In the summer vacation, came back to Westfield, went to visit his brother in New York City, a story I'll tell you in a moment. Returned to Westfield in the late summer or early fall in preparation to go back to Wiley, and promptly died of typhoid fever. Here was a brilliant young man, graduate of Yale, professor of Greek and Latin, whose life was cut short. Edward, the third son, also was very talented in school, although he doesn't seem to have participated in the athletics that his two older brothers did. He graduated from Westfield High School in 1901. Like his brother James, he graduated in the classical course, Greek and Latin. He also gave one of the graduation speeches talking about Booker T. Washington and the aspirations of the middle-class black community. Edward attended Yale, but the shock of his brother's death that fall caused him to drop out temporarily, and instead of graduating the class of 1905, he graduated in the class of 1906. This is the class book giving memories of Edward at Yale. Philip, in the meantime, had worked in his father's shop very unhappily. Finally, in 1899, he struck out for New York City. His father had kept some contacts in the city. Philip decided he was going to make his own career. In New York, he didn't find much success. He had a number of minor laborer's jobs. He was a porter in a hotel. He basically failed at most of the jobs he had. In a few months, he returned to Westfield and got married. He married a young black woman, also from North Carolina, who was then working as a servant in a house of a white family on Broad Street. After their marriage, the pair of them returned to New York City, where Philip had a brilliant idea that he was going to get into the real estate brokerage business. This is Philip and his wife. The brokerage business didn't work. Within a few short months, he was bankrupt. Now, most of what we know about Philip's personal life comes from a book that was published in 1906. The book was published by Booker T. Washington. It's called Black Businessmen, and there was a chapter in there on Philip. Philip provided most of the information. I must say, and I'm going to explain later about Philip's personality, most of what's in that autobiographical material is somewhat open to question. Because Philip describes that he goes bankrupt very, very quickly, and that he and his wife were thrown on the street with their few possessions. They became homeless. They were in such hard up shape that their dog and cat pets starved to death. Well, that's kind of strange, because 2 years later, this is the picture of Philip that appears in the New York newspapers, where he's a highly successful entrepreneur, and this brownstone in the center he has just purchased for $30,000, and in his news release he declares that he spent $4,000 furnishing it. A rather strange turnaround in this story, and it makes no sense. Philip's home survives today. This is the home at number 13, 131st Street, New York City. The home became derelict during the bad days in New York City in the 60s and 70s, but with the great rise in real estate and the rush of new residents in Harlem, it has been restored, and the home exists today. Understanding what Philip was doing and what happened needs a moment's digression. Between 1900 and 1910, 8 million immigrants from Europe passed through the doors of Ellis Island into the United States. At least 1 million of them stayed in New York City. In addition, in conjunction with the ending of Reconstruction in 1876, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, Plessy versus Ferguson ending civil rights in the South in 1896, there began what is known as the Great Migration of blacks out of the South into the cities of the North. The black population in New York City had always been relatively small in comparison to the total population of the city. But by the end of the 19th century, that population began to grow sharply. All of these new people needed housing. Literally hundreds of thousands of people per year were pouring into the city, desperate for housing of any kind. And this had led to a boom in real estate construction above 110th Street. Now that's the area that is known today as Harlem. This construction, apartment blocks, row houses of townhouses, had blossomed, and then in 1908 there was a national depression. Suddenly we have a great demand for housing, We have a great surplus of housing above 110th Street, and owners of that property, desperate to fill the shops, began to cut them up into apartments and rent them to anyone who was available. This provided an opportunity for brokers, people who would match people who needed housing with a great surplus of apartment housing. The other piece of this story, it happened in 1900 at the home of Samuel Courtney in Boston, Massachusetts. A group of young black men associated with Booker T. Washington and his Tuskegee machine met to form the Negro Business League. Booker T. Washington argued that members of the black community needed to develop their own institutions. They should not fight for integration. They instead should concentrate on economic development within their own community. That was the purpose of this Black Businessmen's League. Courtney had gone to school in Westfield. He had come from the American South, been sent up by Richard Armstrong from Hampton Institute. He attended the Westfield Normal School, and he undoubtedly associated with the Payton family. He eventually graduated from Harvard. He became a doctor, an MD. He was Booker T. Washington's personal physician. He set up practice in Boston. He became Booker T. Washington's connection with the Republican Party. At that meeting in 1900, among the young men who formed this organization was Philip Payton Jr. He was, at that point in time, we're told, totally a nobody. It's not clear why he was there, except possibly this personal connection. Within 2 years, he becomes one of the 5 directors of the National Negro Business League, which had over 300 chapters across the United States. By the time he's 25 years old, in other words, he is a prominent figure in Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee organization. The directors of this National Business League formed the Afro-American Investment and Realty Company in New York City. These are Booker T. Washington's men, and there's Philip in 1902. Philip, at this point, is 27 years old, never having been in business, and he's the treasurer of this organization. Again, like the other parts of this story, there are connections here that are unexplained. But Philip has mentors, he has guides. What they do is they go to those row house owners in Harlem, and they say to the owner, look, you're getting X dollars per year in rent. Let us rent the apartments for you, and we'll give you 20% more. Most owners were perfectly happy to do that. And what the Afro-American Realty Company brokers did is they would throw out the white tenants. In those days, you didn't have annual rental contracts. Usually it was by the week or by the month. They would throw out the white tenants and bring in black tenants who were more willing to pay a higher rent in order to improve their housing opportunities. The term for this in the 50s and 60s is blockbusting. They began to cram black residents into these white apartment blocks, charging higher rents, paying the owners a higher mortgage fee, taking off a further amount of money for profit for themselves to pay their own wages, and in theory, since this was a joint stock company, paying dividends to the owners. It worked reasonably well for a short period of time, but the white population began to react, and there were serious attacks on the Afro-American Realty Company for this blockbusting in white neighborhoods. Booker T. Washington always played low-key. The whole purpose of what is known as the Tuskegee machine is not to disturb the white population, to slowly increase power internally and not confront white racists. That was not Philip's program. Philip began to give newspaper interviews throughout the city, chortling about what he was doing, praising their efforts, condemning whites who opposed black entrepreneurship. He drew a lot of attention to the organization. Enough so that Booker T. Washington told his men to drop out of the organization. Also, there may have been a little skullduggery. Philip may have been skimming some of the money off the top, certainly purchasing a townhouse for himself, and he was spending a lot of money on flashy clothes. In 1905 and 6, he bought himself luxury automobiles in a world where cars were a rarity, and there were no dividends being paid to the stockholders. By 1908, his former partners were suing him for malfeasance, and in 1908, he's declared bankrupt again. However, he bounces right back on his own 2 feet because by that time, he has created a second corporation, PAP, the Philip A. Payton Realty Company. He becomes bigger than ever, and he brings his brother Edward into the corporation. He is president, his brother Edward is vice president now, and they have wider and wider publicity. He literally gets newspaper coverage, pro and con, across the nation as the biggest real estate entrepreneur in New York City. Think Donald Trump. He is bigger, flashier, louder than anyone else in sight. Now the problem with this, he's black. In a world where racism is running rampant across the nation, he irritates everybody in sight, and he doesn't care. He just becomes bigger and louder and flashier, announcing that he, quote, owns, unquote, millions of dollars in property. Now, it's quite likely that, like many real estate entrepreneurs before and since, he was using other people's money in order to create this empire and living off the reputation and living off the proceeds of other people's money. Real estate entrepreneurs quite often have this enormous house of cards, and this appears to be Philip himself. Well, he's building things bigger and bigger. Tragedy strikes across his family. His marriage breaks up. His wife occupies the townhouse. He buys property in Allenhurst, New Jersey, on the Jersey Shore, and has another townhouse in Harlem, which is also his office. In 1908, his father dies, and the properties in Westfield are sold. In 1912, his brother Edward contracts tuberculosis. Probably tuberculosis was widespread in the tenements of New York City at the time. he contracts tuberculosis, and Edward dies. His mother comes to live with him, and his sister gives up her teaching job in New Jersey and comes to work in his corporation. Now, there's an interesting incident in the death of his brother Edward in which he appears in the Westfield News once again. The family has a burial plot in Pine Hill Cemetery, and as each member of the family dies, they are buried there. When Edward dies, the family returns to Westfield to bury their son and brother. They go to the Park Square Hotel to get a room. By that time, they've sold their property on Elm Street. And they're turned away because they're black. This is the first time, Philip says, that anyone in town has ever made mention of the fact they're black, or the first time that he ever discovered discrimination in Westfield. It's not clear what they ended up doing, but we know that they had family friends in town in the white community, and probably things were taken care of because they continued to subscribe to the Westfield newspaper. Susan continued to come back to alumni meetings at the Westfield Normal School, and Annie, the mother, continued to correspond with her friends in town. In 1916, Annie died and is brought to Westfield to be buried. In that same year, Philip struck the biggest real estate deal of his life. The New York City newspaper's headlines read that he purchases 6 apartment blocks, not buildings, but blocks in Upper Harlem, worth $7 million. 3 months later, Philip dies of kidney cancer. At that point, things become really murky. Some newspaper stories say that another black entrepreneur took over the property and lowered rents because he had been outraged that Philip had been oppressing black tenements. Another story says that one of Philip's business partners, William Worthman, who had married his sister Susan, ran the property and continued to run PAP until the 1940s. Other newspaper accounts describe various other results of the property, but the reality was Philip never owned the property in the first place. It was owned by a group of white entrepreneurs from New Jersey. Philip had simply been a broker. Susan and her husband, she's Mrs. William Worthman now, continued to live in the city for a number of years. She appears in personal stories in the black newspapers of the day, making various donations to charitable organizations. She died in 1953. Her husband brought her back to be buried in Pine Hill Cemetery, and this led in 1954 to the last official notice in the city of Westfield about the Payton family. This is a newspaper story that appeared, recognized the family. They were still vaguely remembered at that point in time. The family, as I said, is buried in Pine Hill Cemetery. William Worthman put this major monument on their stone. They're on a hill in Pine Hill. Left a space for himself. He's buried there beside his wife, his in-laws. And from that day on, the family disappeared. Now, Philip, and what he did, and how he did it, and why he did it, is still open to a lot of questions. I think you can get an idea of the kind of person that he was in a quote that I found. In 1906, when he's still involved with the Afro-American Realty Company and still deeply involved with the National Negro Business League and Booker T. Washington, Washington invited him to come to Tuskegee University, that was Booker T. Washington's college that he had founded, to give the graduation address. And at that graduation, he said the following, quote, "If I have a business proposition I want to present to an influential capitalist, I present him with my business card. When it reaches its destination, the man whispers, 'Colored man.' The capitalist is curious. He wants to see how I look. He thinks I'm the biggest man in this business. I get on where the white real estate man is turned down. This is the social economic view of race prejudices. What it does is it accepts that unpleasant fact and turns it into money." End quote. Philip was bigger than life. He prevaricated, he fudged, he created a cloud of possibilities, and he built at least the image of an empire in New York City as a successful black man in a world where those possibilities were being closed off. After 1954, he, his family, their position in Westfield and what they had achieved became forgotten.